Well, good afternoon, everybody. As you know, this is the final lecture in the series introducing James Joyce's Ulysses. I'd just like to thank you again for being with me in this strange virtual world. I'm sorry that it's not in person, as I much prefer to see people and make eye contact and get a sense of when people are following or when they're uncertain so that I can explain a point more or whatever and just have the sense of a real conversation. Although it does help, with having some questions at the end and so on. But usually, I think I'd pick on you a bit more and try and draw more out of you. Anyway, we do the best we can. And in this final lecture, I've given the title Joyce's Irish Rebellion, to seek to bring together the two dimensions of modernism that we began this series of lectures by bringing together, the political and the aesthetic. It's in times perhaps of social conflagration that art is pushed to do things in new ways. And certainly that's my general understanding of the period of modernism as one that is responsive in formal ways to the cataclysmic political events of the early 20th century. And in that light of that general framing of modernism, let's go to the more specific framing of Joyce's Ulysses and Joyce's work, which, we've anticipated, we've talked about a little bit already, but it's placing the question of Joyce's work to the situation of Ireland in the earlier 20th century. Let's begin just with a little reminder of what that nightmare, the nightmare as history from which Stephen was trying to awake, is one largely of colonization, of the recognition that Ireland is and has been a colony of England for hundreds of years, and that in and through that there's been a great deal of violence, that Ireland has been depopulated, that a lot of its finances have been drained away in taxation, and that it's suffered from underdevelopment as a country. And Joyce is very concerned with that, as were many, many Irish people in this period, as we see the continued agitation for Ireland's liberation from England, culminating in this period in the well-known Easter uprising of 1916, the failed uprising, but which nonetheless did bring into being the separation of Ireland, its partition in 1922 into the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, and the rest becoming Ireland proper. I want to, before getting to Joyce, to look at the general terms of the cultural representations of the Irish, which Joyce had to engage with. As we know from our own experience in South Africa, no act of colonialism occurs without forms of representation. Let's just look back at some of the ways in which the Irish were represented in ways that made them seem amenable to, or made it seem necessary to be colonized. Look at some of the ways of representing the Irish that were very dominant in the hundreds of years of Ireland's colonization. From very early on, from 1185, from a British work, The History and Topography of Ireland. This is what that early work has to say about the Irish. Dedicated only to leisure and laziness, this is a truly barbaric people. They depend on their livelihoods for animals, and they live like animals. Some hundreds of years later, in 1591, the great poet, famous as the author of The Fairy Queen, wrote a brief note on Ireland, writing that great force must be the instrument, but famine must be the means, for till Ireland be famished, it cannot be subdued. So insisting really on a policy of negligence, of an attack on farming, on the starving of the Irish people, which really anticipated the terrible events of the 19th century and the Great Famine after the potato blight, which killed so many Irish. In 1754, the great philosopher and historian David Hume, in his very popular and influential History of England, wrote, summing up, some centuries now of cruel representations of the Irish, simply states that the Irish, from the beginning of time, have been buried in the most profound barbarism and ignorance. So, not a very nice portrait or representation of the Irish, but one that continues over those hundreds of years and even gets sharper and sharper. And it doesn't only infect politicians and ordinary people, but also the great artists of the period. Henry James, who we've discussed a little bit previously, the great and sophisticated author, perhaps the most sophisticated novelist of the late 19th century, in a letter of 1886, put the following question to his correspondent. How can one speak of the Irish as a great people? I see no greatness, nor any kind of superiority in them, and they seem to me an inferior and third-rate race. And it's hard not to imagine that it's that kind of general cultural attitude of stereotyping of the Irish, which really helps to explain and informed Virginia Woolf's original rather nasty comments about Ulysses. Just to remind you of some of those, she described Ulysses as an illiterate, ill-bred book, it seems to me, the book of a self-taught working man. And we all know how distressing they are, how egotistic, insistent, raw, striking, and ultimately nauseating. So quite harsh words, I think we might say, but coming from very powerful stereotypes with Woolf of working class life, but it's hard not to see those as allied to the general kind of hatred and distrust of the Irish, which we can also see, I thought you might like to see, some of the popular stereotypes of the Irish in newspapers and cartoons of the time. Here we have the Irish Frankenstein, an ape-like figure ready to perform violence on the terrified John Bull-like Englishman. We have the drunken, also ape-like Irishman in America, ready to do all kinds of damage with gunpowder, Uncle Sam's gunpowder, and wielding a bottle of probably whiskey, I imagine. And we have the most recently discovered wild beast on show, which is an Irishman. And summing up the colonialist violence of the stereotypes, a lovely cartoon showing the British lion and the Irish monkey. Powerful and predictable racial stereotypes that I think we should bear in mind when we come to see the kind of problems of acceptance that an Irish artist like Joyce, but also Yeats, and many others had to face when publishing in the wider world. Of course, one of the most immediate reactions to that kind of stereotyping as a savage was to insist on the humanness of the Irish and to promote their own racial identity. In 1893, as we've mentioned before, the Gaelic League was founded to promote the Irish language. By 1904, it had 50,000 members, and 1 year later, that membership had doubled to 100,000, surely showing the rise in a patriotic national consciousness on the part of the Irish, and the attempt to find an authentic Irish identity rooted in the Irish language, which its members promoted, as around them in Ireland the language was beginning to decline and die away, as it had been doing for quite some time. Patrick Pearse, one of the most active of people in the Easter uprising, declared independence for Ireland in that moment, saying, when the position of Ireland's language as her greatest heritage is once fixed, all other matters will insensibly adjust themselves. It will carry all kindred movements with it: Irish music, Irish art, Irish dancing, Irish games and customs, Irish industries, Irish politics. All phases of a nation's life will most assuredly adjust themselves on national lines as best suited to the national character, once that national character is safeguarded by its strongest bulwark, the Irish language. So Irish centrism is what was promoted in this politics of modernism focused on the Irish language. Joyce, however, had some skepticism around this promotion of a uniquely Irish identity, of an identity politics based on the Irish language. And he wasn't shy of putting forward his rather unpopular positions. In an essay written in 1900, which I've already quoted from and briefly discussed, Joyce championed the dramatic works of the Norwegian dramatist Ibsen, And in championing that, he did write a very interesting sentence that rings so true in this particular moment of social media frenzy around the American elections, suggesting that the task of the artist or the political artist is first clear our minds of cant and alter the falsehoods to which we have lent our support. So advocating a very self-consciously critical approach to the politics of aesthetics. Joyce gave that paper as a lecture to the higher education establishment he was in at the time, and was disappointed in the response, but probably not surprised at the response that it got from the attendants. In Stephen Hero, his first draft of a portrait of the artist, or a sketch for the portrait of the artist, really, not really a first draft as such, as it's so radically different. He remembers the moment of its reception in the following terms, noting how the climax of aggressiveness was reached when the nationalist student Hughes stood up, saying, "They wanted no foreign filth. The Irish people had their own glorious literature. Mr. Dedalus was himself a renegade from the nationalist ranks. He professed cosmopolitanism. But a man that was critical of his countries was of no country. You must first have a nation to have art." I'm sorry, I can't read, the end of the quotation, so you have to forgive me if they're a little wrong. In that draft, Stephen positions himself as professing a cosmopolitanism which is directed against the nationalist politics of the Ireland of his time, of the Irish literary movement of his time. And many of his critical and journalistic writings in the period show the kind of academic grounds of that scepticism, that attempt to clear our minds of cant and alter the falsehoods to which we have lent our support. And the most powerful of these and the most sustained is a lecture he gave in Italy, 1907, called Island of Saints and Sages, where in a essay form he argues his case very interestingly and persuasively. And it's something, if you're interested in the question, you could well do to follow up. And it does give a tremendous amount of background to various comments and positions taken in Ulysses. So I'll talk about it a little bit here. Joyce's main point in the essay is to stress the original cosmopolitanism of Ireland, how the idea of a single national identity of blood and race is just not correct. Even a superficial review, he states, shows us that the Irish nation's current desire to create its own civilization is not so much the desire of a young nation wishing to link itself to Europe's concert, but the desire by an ancient nation to renew it in a modern form the glories of a past civilization. And Joyce's point here is that if you look at the question of Irish nationalism historically, you begin to see that nationalism is a complex and cosmopolitan thing in itself. And he points to how, for instance, It's the descendants of the Danes, the Normans, and the Anglo-Saxon colonizers championed the cause of the new Irish nation against British tyranny. Recently, he points out, an Irish deputy boasted that he was of an ancient race and upbraided his opponent for being a descendant of a Cromwellian settler. This, he writes, actually caused general amusement in the press, for in the present nation it would be impossible to exclude all those who are descended from foreign families, and points out that the key nationalist politician, the most successful until his downfall, was Parnell. He was perhaps the most formidable man to lead the nationalist movement, and in his veins not a single drop of Celtic blood ran. So somebody's got their microphone on. If they could turn it off, please. From this position, Joyce felt that the only thing one could do was to go into either internal or external exile, if you were to be honest. And Joyce's essay ends with a kind of moving plea, which explains some of his own feelings about leaving Ireland. He tries to defend his leaving of Ireland, summing up the plight of the Irish in the present moment. He writes of colonial dependency and underdevelopment. He writes of how the economic and intellectual conditions of his homeland do not permit the individual to develop. No self-respecting person wants to stay in Ireland. Instead, he will run from it, as if from a country that has been subjected to a visitation by an angry Jove. That is why millions of Irish have left their homelands for other shores. So Joyce sees Ireland through the lens of colonialism. He's very aware of the depredations that British colonialism have visited on Ireland. But where he differs from some of his fellow Irish aesthetic nationalists is that he draws attention to the fact that it's not only from Britain that Ireland has been suffering, it's also from the Roman Catholic Church. And he writes, I confess I do not see what good it does to fulminate against English tyranny, while the tyranny of Rome still holds the dwelling place of the soul. So Joyce has a slightly different set of coordinates for rebellion and seeking an identity for a new Ireland. They lie not simply in asserting a pristine Irish identity, but in recognizing the real complexity of Irish identity historically, and seeing that the main driving forces that have to be resisted are British colonialism and also, if you can put it this way, Catholic colonialism. Not surprisingly, thinking that way, he didn't feel he could keep his home in Ireland. As I say, it's such a fascinating essay to read, Islands of Saints and Sages. I can't remember if I put it into the file of potential readings. If it isn't there, please let me know and I can add it if you're interested. But we find the traces of those arguments throughout Joyce's work. And of course, it comes up again and again, not only in Stephen Hero and A Portrait of the Artist, but also before that in Dubliners, in the final story of Dubliners in particular, the extraordinary story, The Dead. And this is in the encounter between another nationalist young person, Miss Ivors, and another kind of avatar of Joyce, Gabriel, in the story. In the story, Miss Ivors dances with Gabriel, and while they're dancing, she puts some stern questions to him. "I have found out," she says, "you write for the Daily Express," a British paper. "Now, aren't you ashamed of yourself? I didn't think you were a West Briton." And a West Briton is the pejorative term for an Irish person who supports Britain. Gabriel did not know how to meet her charge. He wanted to say that literature was above politics. They keep on dancing, and Miss Ivors probes him more. "And why do you go to France and Belgium in your holidays, instead of visiting your own land?" "Well," said Gabriel, "it's partly to keep in touch with the languages and partly for a change." "And haven't you your own language to keep in touch with?" "Irish," asked Miss Ivors. "Well," said Gabriel, "if it comes to that, you know, Irish is not my language, to tell you the truth. To tell you the truth, I'm sick of my own country, sick of it." And in that, you have something which comes up, as we'll see later in Ulysses, the ways in which these claims for trying to reclaim Gaelic as the Irish language are a little bit of a fantasy. Gabriel admits here that Irish, in the sense of Gaelic, simply isn't a language he speaks. And this is going to become very important for understanding the whole of Joyce's work and the nature of what I'd call Joyce's anti-imperialism. Because whether he shared or not the tactics, strategies, goals and aims of the Irish literary renaissance of the period, he didn't. He did share a differently nuanced anti-imperialism. "If a victorious country," he writes, "tyrannizes over another, it cannot logically take it amiss if the latter reacts. Men are made that way, and no one, unless he were blinded by self-interest or ingenuity, can still believe that a colonizing country is prompted by purely Christian motives when it takes over foreign shores, for all that the missionary and the Bible come some months ahead of the arrival of the army and machine guns. If the Irish have not been able to do what their American brothers did, this does not mean that they will never do so. In other words, to have a liberating revolution that releases them from the grips of the colonial power." I find it a bit naive, though, to heap insults on the Englishman for his actions in Ireland. After all, what England did in Ireland over the centuries is really no different from what the Belgians are doing today in the Congo Free State. She inflamed the factions and took possession of the wealth. So Joyce is staunchly anti-imperialist and writes in favour of decolonizing Ireland, but in a ways which it's not clear to him what that would mean. He rejects the simplicity of asserting a pristine Irish identity that can be returned to, and a return with that of the Irish language. He questions the continuity of a Catholic Church in Ireland if Ireland is to progress. So he doesn't have many allies in the moment of anti-colonial struggle, which was the Irish literary movement. Now, I've mentioned all that really as some background and something to add to your reading of Ulysses. And I want to turn now to just a couple of moments or moments in a couple of episodes from the novel where these questions of Irish nationalism and colonialism really come into focus, and which I think will be much more legible to you after hearing the first part of the talk today. In Telemachus, the first episode of the novel, and I'm really hoping that after this week, Telemachus will have become much more legible to you, as we've talked about it the most. What is crucial here in that first episode is what happens between Stephen and Haynes. Haynes, the Englishman, the visiting scholar, who is there as a kind of cultural colonizer or entrepreneur, as a kind of anthropologist, to come and look at the Irish and to collect some of their sayings and some of their stories, some of their folk history, and who is absolutely astonished by Stephen, as Buck Mulligan explains, because he's amazed to find that Stephen is just as intelligent, or is even more intelligent than Haynes is himself. As Mulligan puts it, he thinks you have the real Oxford manner, the Oxford University manner, the high culture of England. And, you know, in saying that, it's recalling without saying all the stereotypes of Irish laziness and stupidity which the Irish artist had to confront. Nonetheless, Haynes and Stephen do have some conversation in the episode, and Haynes, Joyce is at pains to stress, isn't as bad and isn't as prejudiced as he might be. "You behold in me," Stephen said with a grim displeasure, "a horrible example of free thought." I pause there because I think we can gloss that with materials from what I said previously. Stephen, like Joyce, is a horrible example of free thought because free thought, challenging all the cant and so on that I mentioned before, puts you in a very isolated and lonely position, a position of internal exile in your own country. Haynes replies, "After all, I should think you were able to free yourself. You were your own master, it seems to me." Haynes is very impressed by the quality of Stephen's intellect. But when Haynes says he's your own master, that is something Stephen can't accept. "I am the servant of two masters," Stephen said, "an English and an Italian." "Italian?" Haynes said again. "What do you mean?" And Stephen specifies, as we've seen Joyce does in his other writings, "I am the servant of two masters, an English and an Italian, the imperial British state and the Holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church." And Stephen, whose motto we said before is known, "Serviam," I will not serve, or I do not serve, has to free himself from both of those forces. And in the struggle to do that is also what Ulysses is about. And I'll come back to that in a moment. It's how to find a space for criticizing both of those things, both of those massive cultural and political forces, not in the English language itself. I'll come back to it. In the English language itself, I say, because as we saw previously, Joyce rejects the policy of ethno-linguistic identity, of turning back to Gaelic, which many of his compatriots were doing, of promoting a kind of fake Irish culture. And in the book, in this episode, he does that in particular through depicting an encounter between a poor working Irish old woman who comes round to sell them milk in the morning. As she's selling them the milk, there's the irony and the paradox and the funniness of Haynes, who's there, as I said before, as a kind of student of Irish ways and folklores. Haynes addresses the woman in Irish, in Gaelic, that is to say. Do you understand what he says? Stephen asked her, the old woman, the milkwoman. Is it French you are talking, sir? The old woman said to Haynes. Haynes spoke to her again, a longer speech, confidently. Irish, Buck Mulligan said. Is there Gaelic on you? Mulligan is asking the milkmaid, the milkwoman, does she speak Gaelic? Oh, I thought it was Irish, she said, by the sound of it. Are you from the West, sir? I am an Englishman, Haynes answered. He's English, Mulligan says, and he thinks we should all speak Irish in Ireland. The humour is Joyce's way of putting out that he still disagrees with the aesthetic politics of the Irish literary revival. Throughout the book, there's many, many references and discussions of British colonialism, of Irish history and its suffering under English colonialism, and the politics, the new politics of Sinn Féin. It's in the Cyclops episode that the question of Irish nationalist politics comes most to the fore. And I just wanted to, again, have a quick look at that as we close this week's lectures, as that is the most powerful iteration of Joyce's cosmopolitan politics. The Cyclops episode takes place in Barney Kiernan's pub, where Bloom has stepped in for a drink, and it features a character who has no name, but is simply called the Citizen throughout. And the chapter itself is given from the perspective of someone else who has no name, is given no name, to reflect or to make a connection to the Homeric episode where Odysseus escapes the Cyclops by telling him, when the Cyclops asked him what his name is, who is attacking him, he says, no one. My name is no one. So when the Cyclops calls for help, he says, no one is attacking me, no one. So in the pub, the Citizen is surrounded by his ardent nationalist friends, and Bloom comes in and, in the way of Irish public house conversations, joins in the general conversation, but begins to query some of the nationalist tenets and commonplaces of the Citizen. As he does this, he is picked out as a Jew and finally leaves, chased by the Citizen's savage dog, Gary Owen. Now, this chapter, again, at a first reading, is very weird, but that weirdness is easily sorted out once you recognise that Joyce is again using a kind of montage technique where there are two kind of two parallel narratives. The first is the realist narrative, more or less realist, of the conversations in the pub between the citizen and other people, between Bloom and other people and the citizen. Those conversations are given in pretty, on the whole, straightforward English stroke Irish. But between them are a series of parodic and inflated writing, which draw on Irish myths, advertising, and other forms of hyperbolic writing to give some of the bluster of the citizen and some of the bluster of nationalism, to make fun, in other words, of, in our terms, I suppose, a Malema-like sort of nationalism. Is what the technique is doing there. So that, let me just give you an example of some of that parodic writing which frames the conversations. And lo, as they quaffed their cup of joy, a godlike messenger came swiftly in, radiant as the eye of heaven, a comely youth, and behind him there passed an elder of noble gait and countenance, bearing the sacred scrolls of law, and with him his lady wife, a dame of peerless lineage, fairest of her race. An inappropriate and parodic language for describing some of the people who were in the pub. And contrasted with that, a very different set of narrative registers. Little Alf Bergen popped in round the door. Elf kept making sings out of the door. And begob, what was it only that bloody old pantaloon, Dennis Breen in his blast slippers with two bloody big books under his oxter and wife Hotfoot after him. But that's just the, as I say, Joyce in that episode parodying the pretensions of nationalist discourse with the use of a parallel montage of inflated heroic language. More importantly is the substance of the conversations which take place. Conversations which really identify Joyce's cosmopolitan politics set against the nationalist politics of his peers. And as I mentioned before, it's really important to, get hold of the basics of the book. And it's this, as Adam was saying yesterday in conversation, Ulysses is such an Irish book. Joyce took such great care to make all the details of this one day in Ireland absolutely spot on and correct. Nothing could be more Irish than this book. But Joyce, we've seen, is suspicious of Irish nationalism that his compatriots were taking on and assuming. So I think that comes through in his choice of character. The central character, as Stephen, who comes first but isn't quite the central character really, the central character is the Odysseus figure, the Ulysses figure, is a Jewish guy, is Leopold Bloom. And it's such an extraordinary thing, and it would have been a red rag to a bull to Joyce's peers who supported this Irish nationalist literary revival, to make the central figure of this great Irish novel a Jewish person, and to give him a platform for saying certain things as we have here, things which throw into doubt all the easy assumptions of nationalism, all the things which in that earlier quotation I gave to you, Joyce thinks of in a sense as cant, as received ideas, as things you think, but you've never thought them through. Bloom replies to the nasty nationalism of the citizen by summing up what those views add up to, which is persecution. Persecution, says he, all the history of the world is full of it, perpetuating national hatred among nations. And remember, Joyce is writing this in and through the First World War, although what he's saying, of course, rings true in today's contemporary political events, perpetuating national hatreds of various kinds, from Trump to Brexit. But do you know what a nation means, says John Wise. Yes, says Bloom. What is it, says John Wise. A nation, says Bloom. A nation is the same people living in the same place. By God then, says Ned, laughing, if that's so, I'm a nation, for I've been living in the same place for the past 5 years. Or also living in different places, says Bloom. That covers my case, says Joe. Here, what Joyce is doing is poking fun at any easy assumption of what nationality may be. In this, he's anticipating, by 100 years or so, all the complex debates that we're currently engaging around questions of national identity in an age of migration and emigration from Europe to the USA to South Africa itself. What is your nation, if I may ask, asks the citizen. Ireland, says Bloom. I was born here, Ireland. The citizen said nothing, only cleared the spit out of his gullet, and gob, he spat a red bank oyster out of him right in the corner. But it's no use, says Bloom. Force, hatred, history, all that, that's not life for men and women, insult and hatred. And everybody knows that it's the very opposite of that is really life. Love, he says, I mean the opposite of hatred. That's Bloom's position, and in a sense behind it, Joyce's. Joyce wants to reject force, hatred, and history, that kind of history. It's not really life, he says. And the fact that that kind of scepticism about nationalism, that rejection of force and violence, is shared by Stephen, is part of what brings them together in the end, and part of what, if you like, the message of the book is. We have to find ways of resisting violence. In the second episode, Nestor, Stephen anticipates, or in a sense repeats, what Bloom's conclusions will be. Mr. Deasy says, we are a generous people, but we must also be just. I fear those big words, Stephen said, which make us so unhappy. The big words he means are the received ideas of being a generous people, saying we must be just. What do those things mean? He's not so sure, when they can be used to promote violence. Mark my words, Mr. Dedalus, he said. England is in the hands of the Jews, in all the highest places, her finance, her press, and they are the signs of a nation's decay. And Mr. Deasy goes on into an anti-Semitic rant, which Stephen punctures by a simple linguistic clarification or question, as Mr. Deasy refers to Jews above all as merchants. A merchant, Stephen said, is one who buys cheap and sells dear, Jew or Gentile, is he not? And with that question, Jew or Gentile, punctures the idea, the racist idea of Jews only as merchants. But in his conversation with Deasy and those around him, he finds it's a nightmare. History, Stephen said, is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. All those forces of violence, all that cant, all that deception and self-deception, it's too much. How can you find a way out of it? Stephen Joyce leaves his country. He writes Ulysses. In a sense, that's his answer. It goes back to all those experiments I've tried to indicate with you, all that freeing of himself from colonialism, from the church, trying to seek a space of freedom. In the end, it all comes down to a certain politics of language for Joyce, but not the reinstatement, the seeking to find, to return to Gaelic as an original identity language. In a portrait, Stephen notes how, when he's arguing with one of his teachers, the language we are speaking, an English-born teacher, the language we are speaking is his before it is mine. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master, on his lips and on mine. I cannot speak or write these words without unrest of spirit. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted its words. My voice holds them at bay. My soul frets in the shadow of his language. In relation to that problem of the colonization of the self by a foreign language, it's so important to recognize that Joyce doesn't shy away from that problem, doesn't seek refuge in the fantasy of seeking to reforge an authentic Irish identity and turn to Gaelic, a return to a lost Gaelic. Instead, what he does is force that language differently, to recognize that it's an acquired speech, but then to master it and force it to submit. That really is a great part of the energy of Joyce's writing, what drives him through innovation after innovation. It's to create from within English something which in a sense surpasses English, becomes Joyce speak. And I'll stop there as we're running out of time, and also because we've got a power cut scheduled in 5 minutes time. But I'm hoping that the introduction to Joyce, closing on this very small and limited discussion of Joyce's Irishness, shows the ways in which his work is nourished by an extraordinary anti-colonial energy, which is one well worth attending to in our own complex situation in South Africa. Thank you again for your kind participation in this strange virtual world. And let me open this up to any comments, questions, or queries that you'd like to make. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me in this attempt. Any questions? Deirdre, I see your hand is raised.
Hello, I just wanted a little parting notes. I've been reading the history of teacher John Sullivan, and at some point he makes this observation. If you can just lift up the top of your head.
I'm sorry, Deirdre, I can't hear you. You're just breaking up too much. Could you maybe type out your question? I actually can't hear it.
John, I have a solution to that. If possible, would you be able to mute yourself briefly while Deirdre asks a question because it's a bit of an echo, and then you could obviously unmute to answer it. Deirdre, you're welcome to ask your question again.
Okay, if there's still an echo, tell me now.
No, it's perfect.
Okay, I was just actually making an observation. I've been reading a little history of literature by John Sutherland, and at some point he mentions that he went through an exercise to write down 10 great authors of English literature. If you could think of just the top of his head, Irish: Jonathan Swift, Bram Stoker, Oscar Wilde, W.B. Yeats, James Joyce, George Bernard Shaw, Samuel Beckett, C.S. Lewis, Edna O'Brien, Seamus Heaney. That's quite a list if you think of how earlier English writers trashed them because they were Irish. That is a heck of an impressive list. Thought I'd just make that observation.
Yeah, no, it's a good list, and you'll see that Joyce himself also does the same, you know, in confronting those stereotypes. From his perspective, he talks about how Edmund Burke was regarded as the single best speaker that the English Parliament ever had. He also mentions Jonathan Swift and Oscar Wilde and, you know, Sheridan and Goldsmith and, you know, various others. It's one of those things where, well, it's like one of my favorite phrases is you think, but you've never thought it through. And of course, once you're actually forced to confront the reality of the power of Irish writing and culture through those names you've mentioned and others, the stereotype has to fall away. You know, but the point of a stereotype is to not allow you to think things through carefully. And we see the power of that, the increasing power of that, exacerbated by social media in the world today, I think. So Joyce's things of trying to resist cant and hypocrisy are probably more important than ever. Thank you, Deirdre, and thank you for your kind participation through the lectures. Yeah, Altai, I see you have a question.
You got the name right.
Phew. Well, that work this week has been worth it.
Well done. I wanted to ask two things. The first one is, can you make these slides available for us? Or maybe I just haven't been checking my email right because I haven't received them. But my second question is that...
Well, let me just answer that first one. I think Lance will make them available. That's his... They are supposed to be available.
Okay. Yeah. I apologize if I've been checking my email wrong, Lance. And my second question is just... when I look at the writing of someone like Joyce, there's so much anti-imperialism and, how do I put this, like almost, I don't know if I can call it post-colonial or anti-colonial, because that word has got such a strong connection to, I think, South American, African, and Indian writing. But it's very rarely associated with, for example, the writing of Irish literature. And it's this very strange, I remember I had a conversation in undergrad with a person whose opinions I disagreed with very greatly, where he complained about the decolonized literature syllabus and said he wished he would have more Irish authors in the syllabus. And I found such a strange thing to be said, in which, and then Deirdre actually mentioned a little bit where they mentioned the best British authors, and Irish authors are brought up. So I was wondering if you had any comments about this juxtaposition between anti-colonial, I can't think of a word for it, third world literature versus the anti-colonial literature of the Irish.
Well, I suppose it's in part a part of maybe one way of thinking about it, Altai, is when we think of canonical works, we often are taught to think of them in quite depoliticized ways, or we used to be taught to think of them in depoliticized ways. When that was done, in thinking about Joyce, you'd think about him as a great modernist writer or whatever, but you wouldn't focus so much on his Irishness, strangely enough. So that you have, in the 1950s and 60s, many discussions of Joyce, but they don't talk a huge amount about his anti-imperialism and so on. And indeed, in some discussions, all talk of politics would simply not be relevant to talking about literature. But then there's a big change in the, I think, in some ways it goes back to a conference organized by Seamus Dean, in which Edward Said and Frederick Jameson and Terry Eagleton were asked to come and talk about Irish literature in a colonial, post-colonial perspective. And they delivered 3 quite powerful lectures, which are available in a little book. I forget the title of it. And that kind of opened up, or reflected an opening up of a different reading of Joyce, one which made connections between Joyce's very consciously anti-colonial, anti-imperialist stand and the writing of the books. But somehow that had been a little invisible or marginalized before. So, you read works differently as times and optics change. But I think, also what you're talking about is, I remember teaching a course on Ulysses a few years ago, and one of my students said, how can you teach this Western literature? It's just white literature. And I said, well, just hang on a bit and read it a bit more, and you'll see that actually, it's a literature full of anti-colonial ideas and so on. And the guy did, to his credit, stick around and read it and completely changed his mind about Joyce. So, there are a lot of dynamics involved, I think, and that's what you're expressing. But I think now people would, in general, people would begin to make connections between Ireland and decolonization in ways which they might not have done so, 50 years ago.
Okay, thanks, John.
No, thank you, Arthur.